Hello, this is Chris Safarova. Welcome to another episode of the Strategy Skills podcast. Our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It is a free download. Go to firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And if you're currently preparing for interviews and want to improve your resume, get McKinsey and BCG winning resume. It is also a free download. Go to firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. And today we are speaking with Kandi Wiens. Kandi is a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania and director of the Penn Masters in Medical Education program. She often teaches in various graduate level programs across the University of Pennsylvania. She is a researcher, national speaker, focused on helping leaders hone and use their emotional and social intelligence to increase their positive impact and protect themselves from burnout. And so today we are going to talk about if you can actually protect yourself from burnout, if you can become immune to burnout. Kandi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's great to be here with you.
Kandi, I know that you grew up in an Indian reservation in eastern Montana, and you have a very beautiful and unusual name. Is there a story behind it?
There is a bit of a story behind my name. Thank you for asking that. My grandmother on my mom's side absolutely loved candy. She ate candy all the time. And she somehow convinced my mom to name me Kandi, but they wanted to spell it a little bit differently. So they spelled it Kandi instead of the traditional Candy.
I love it. That was my guess about the origin of the name. So both of us had very difficult childhoods. When I was reading your book, it was so incredible. As we were talking about before we started recording, it seemed like we are the same person in many ways, only live in different parts of the world. We had so many similar experiences. And of course, we had a lot of adversity-induced stress and insecurity-driven anxiety. So maybe let's start with discussion on how did you even become so interested in burnout and studying it?
Yeah, I love the question about how I became interested in wanting to become a burnout expert, because it's not something I dreamed of doing or being when I was a little girl, or even in my early stages of my career. Like, who wants to be a burnout expert? That sounds like it'd be quite depressing to want to study and really immerse yourself and create a career based on something that so many people suffer from, which is burnout. But what happened was I suffered from a very serious life-threatening health crisis because I was so stressed and burned out at work. And I tell that whole story in the book. But that really started a wake-up call for me, a bit of a psychological wake-up call, as well as, of course, physical, because I had such a health crisis. And when I was recovering from that health crisis and really starting to wake up to what my current situation was, and starting to recognize more and more what my work was doing to me and how unhealthy my relationship was with work. It wasn't just the work environment that I was in, because I actually worked for a really amazing company, but it was my relationship with work that was quite unhealthy. So I came out of that health crisis. And at the same time, right about that time, I was studying for my doctoral degree. And I'd finished all of my coursework, and I was starting to think about a topic for my dissertation study. And I was studying many different topics that I was very interested in. And I started coming up on a lot of literature on resilience and coping with stress. And then this thing called burnout. Burnout, to me, back in the early 2010s, was not something that we heard a lot about. Maybe a little bit in the healthcare industry where we're starting to hear about it. But I didn't know that much about it until I started immersing myself in the literature and reading about the fact that burnout is a psychological syndrome that people experience because of chronic stress at work. And I was like, oh, wow, that's exactly what I went through. I had a psychological experience with work that caused my body to break down and caused me to have this big wake-up call. And so when I came across a lot of that literature I was reading, it just hit me. I have to study this. I have to dig into it. And what I was most interested in, and this is what my research reflects, is that throughout my career, I've worked alongside a lot of people who have experienced just as much stress as I did at work, yet they didn't seem like they were burning out. And I always wondered, like, what is it with these people that I considered to be resilient role models people who could experience a high degree of stress, yet they weren't burning out. They were overworked, of course, maybe, and they were feeling the stress like I was, but they weren't, their bodies and their psyche weren't breaking down and burning out. So that's what my research started to look at. And that's why I became interested in it, because I was just so fascinated by these people who have what I now call burnout immunity.
And what do you feel those high performers who are immune to burnout or seem to be immune, what are they doing different?
Let's go right to it. Yes, the X factor. That's exactly what I wanted to research. So when I started my research, I thought the number one thing I want to do is I want to have my research study participants tell me how much stress they're experiencing at work. And so I gave them a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst possible stress you've experienced over a 6-month period. And so I had all these people tell me what their stress levels were. And then I also had them complete a research instrument. It's a very high quality, validated research instrument called the Maslow Burnout Inventory. And I measured whether or not they are burned out. And then I looked at the people who were telling me that their stress was severe, very severe, or worst possible. And literally, people who tell me that their stress is severe, very severe, or worst possible over a period of 6 months, but they're not burned out. That's what I wanted. What I wanted to know from these people is, what are they doing? They're clearly experiencing a lot of stress, but they're also clearly not burned out when we use this really high quality research instrument. So then I conduct interviews with them. And what I found out is essentially everything that readers will learn in my book. So very briefly, it comes down to core emotional and social intelligence skills. And each of these skills has a chapter devoted to it in the book. So I'll quickly go through each one of those 5 categories. I have framed this around what I call the ARMOR framework, ARMOR. So the A is for awareness, and the awareness chapter has a lot of information. It has exercises, reflection questions, tools, and strategies that help people better understand their specific reasons that cause greater vulnerability to burnout. They also are able to take a tool that I created. It's called the Burnout Risk Assessment. It helps people learn and really understand and really pinpoint what degree of risk are they at in terms of acquiring burnout or becoming burned out from work. So that's the first chapter, awareness. There's a lot more information in there about how we use our awareness, our emotional awareness, and our awareness of our behaviors and patterns and all of that. The R in the ARMOR framework is for regulation. And that chapter is all about how we regulate our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors when we're under stress. So when we have a stressful experience happening, what's going on with our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors? What are we doing in the moment? And then also, what are we doing after that acute experience happens that is either in service of our stress response or is working against our stress response? So that chapter is dedicated to learning how to better regulate emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, but also regulate our own individual stress response system. So Chris, you and I, for example, we might experience the exact same stressor, but I might feel it more intensely than you. And so I need to learn about my stress response just as you would yours. And we might approach how we regulate our emotions, thoughts, and behaviors differently just based on our unique makeup. So that's the R. The M in the ARMOR framework is about meaningful connections. The people that I studied who have burnout immunity have meaningful connections with other people. So that's relationships. They have meaningful connections to their values. They are very, very clear on what their values are, and they live a values-driven, purpose-driven life. And they create boundaries around their values. The third meaningful connection they have is to meaningful work. So many of the people with burnout immunity have a sense that the work that they do is meaningful, that it adds pro-social value to other people. It's good. The work that they do is good for other people or their community. So that's the M in the ARMOR framework. The O in the ARMOR framework is about outlook. So think of outlook as the ability to have a positive outlook versus a negative or pessimistic outlook on life. That chapter also has a number of other just mindsets, like what is it What are the mindsets, the 4 vital mindsets of people with burnout immunity? They're optimistic and have a positive outlook, of course, but many of them also believe that stress is enhancing, that they believe that stressful experiences are things that they can learn from, grow from, and improve upon. They also are very focused on serving others. So they have a mindset where they're serving others. That's part of their outlook. And then there's a 4th vital mindset that takes all of the awareness that they learned throughout the book so far and it puts into action. How do you care about yourself? So having a mindset where you're not just aware, but you are aware and care about and for yourself to protect your psychological health. And then the final R in the ARMOR framework is what I call the 3RX prescription, has 3 R's. The first R is about recovery. So, of course, anytime I encounter someone who is burned out or very high risk of burnout, the first and most important they can do is take some time to slow down and truly recover, both physically and psychologically. And there are a number of tips and strategies that help people recover from psychological stress. The second R is about reconnecting. So reconnecting to the things that are and people in our lives that are meaningful. And then the third R is about reimagining. So reimagining after we've recovered from major stress and major burnout, how do we reimagine the relationship that we want to have with work going forward? How do we want work to fit into our lives? So that's the ARMOR framework: awareness, regulation, meaningful connections, outlook, and then the 3RX, which is recover, reconnect, reimagine. And those are all ways that we're using our emotional and social intelligence to protect ourselves from burnout.
Kandi, and did you notice any similarities in terms of the level of adversity in persons' past, the way they grew up, in terms of people who are very resilient, people who experience stress in a stronger way? Because I know there is some research on how if you had very difficult childhood, the stress you experience from the same situation is much higher than a person who didn't have such background.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Those are called ACEs, ACE, adverse childhood events. Adverse childhood events includes physical abuse, mental, sexual abuse. It includes living with a parent or a guardian who was an alcoholic or a drug addict. It may also include moving a lot as a child, a number of other things. And the research shows that children who grow up with 3 or more adverse childhood events, there are a number of studies that show that they are at higher risk potentially for burnout. But here's the really interesting thing. There is an X factor to people like you and I, for example, who had a number of adverse childhood events. And I talk about some of mine in my book. I'm very open and about my childhood to some degree. But what's interesting is that for people like us who had a number of adverse childhood events, but if we had a supportive, loving home environment, or we had even one person in our life, it may have been a teacher or a coach or someone in our Sunday school, someone who helped us feel loved and supported and seen, that can offset the effects of the adverse childhood event. And so that's pretty consistent in the literature, and it came up over and over again in my research as well. And that, I mean, these people that I studied, a number of them did have very, very difficult childhoods. And many of them to this day say that those adverse events made them stronger, more resilient people today because they learned from teachers and friends and cousins and grandparents, whoever it may be. They learned from someone that there are healthier ways to cope with stress. And so they built up that strength and that resilience to protect themselves.
And that makes a lot of sense. I can really understand how it feels when you have this one person, you have really bad childhood, but you have this one person, even when they die, you have something to hold on to. You know that you are valuable, you have something to bring to the world. For me, it was my grandmother.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I would ask your readers who have had those kinds of experience in the past, would ask them to think of someone in your life that instilled something in you that is still with you today. That because of that person's presence and their influence on your life and their love and their care, they instilled some values in you that today are still with you. And those can be a major source of resilience, a major source of strength to help us through really tough times.
That is very true. So coming back to our listeners who are now listening, and some of them are struggling with burnout, I think that we gave them some very good overview, but there's no clarity for them on what do they do. What do they actually do differently on Monday morning to change in their life and become a person who actually much more resilient to burnout?
Yeah. That's a question that depends so much on everybody's unique experience. And it depends whether the individual is experiencing a lot of stress because the work environment that they're in the stress is caused by too much of a workload, or is it caused by lack of quality and equity and fairness in the culture, or is the stress caused by lack of skills? In other words, an employee who is maybe new to their role or new to a company and they just don't have the skills yet, and so they have a steep learning curve. If their stress is caused by that, their solution, their remedy is going to be a whole lot different. And so all of this is like, it's similar. And I'm not saying it's a very, very good question, but I encourage listeners and hopefully eventually readers to think of it in terms of you're going to your doctor about you have some physical symptoms. You're not quite sure what's causing you might have some idea, but not quite sure exactly what's causing your physical symptoms. You just know that you have some symptoms. You don't feel well. You don't feel physically well. And it's the same thing with psychological health. Until we know exactly what's causing it, doctors likely will not recommend a remedy or a prescription or a solution or a treatment plan or anything until they can pinpoint really what's going on and what's causing it. And so the book often offers a number of things. That's a very vague answer. I get that. I understand that. But I can tell you, maybe it would help if I give everybody at least 3 things that they can think about, because these are 3 common things that all of us have control over that we can do something differently with. I would say, and there are more than 3, by the way, it's not just limited to 3, but I'll give you 3 really big ones that I see. Number 1 is be aware of and manage your thinking traps. So thinking traps are things that distort the way we think about things. So let's say, for example, you're new to an organization, or you have a new role or something like that. And prior to moving into that role, you felt very confident in your abilities and your performance and all of that. But now in this new role, you're really nervous and you're starting to suffer from what's called imposter syndrome. You might feel like, oh, I don't know if I really belong here. I don't know if I'm good enough. Everyone else around me seems really smart. So that's a thinking trap. Imposter syndrome is one thinking trap that we can get caught in that creates what I call self-inflicted stress. We're either creating new stress or we're amplifying stress that's out there because we're thinking about things in a way that comes from a place of insecurity or anxiety or some past experience. Another thinking trap, which, by the way, I write about all of these thinking traps in a Harvard Business Review article, so you can get a quick view of those. But another thinking trap might be a perfectionist trap. Some of us are very focused on doing the best possible job we can at everything, and we say yes to everything, and everything just has to be just right. Well, that's great until it starts to create and add on more stress for us. Another common thinking trap is overly high expectations of ourselves or other people. Another thinking trap is excessive need for control. People who like to have control of things and like to control other people or have an influence on other people. Again, that's a thinking trap. So this number 1 tip I have is become very aware of and manage, like actively manage. Think about the fact that this thinking trap is getting in my way, number 1, and number 2, that it's creating or amplifying stress for me. So that would be tip number 1, is watching those thinking traps and managing your way out. Number 2 is watching and managing your emotional investment in work. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the types of stress that cause an emotional reaction, let's say, for example, you work in a company and there are a lot of changes, and maybe your job is changing, or you have a new boss, or some workflows, different things are changing, and you don't have any control over that. Most likely, you're going to have an emotional reaction to that. managing our emotional investment in that is one good step. So really just first of all, checking ourselves, like, how intense are my emotions about this change? Do I potentially have any influence over this? Or is it just happening to me? Am I just on the receiving end of a big change and I don't have anything to do with it? But if we're aware of and we can start to regulate our emotional investment in work, that can also lessen our subjective experience of the stress itself. So those are two big things. I would say one of the third biggest thing that I would ask your listeners to pay attention to is when you experience a stressor, do you first have a reaction where you feel threatened by it? Or do you feel like, oh, okay, this is really going to be horrible. This stress is going to be hard, but I think I can actually learn something from it. I know it's going to be really hard to go through it, but I've been through these kinds of things before. I've managed hard things in my life before, and I have the confidence to get through it. That's what I call a stress is enhancing mindset. So that would be that third thing, is that when you are faced with a new stressor, just ask yourself, do I feel really threatened here and scared and totally out of control? Or do I feel that there's actually something in this experience that I might be able to learn and grow from? So the more we can shift from a threat response to what's called a challenge response, we're basically training our brains and training our emotional reaction to be one that's much more productive and healthy for us. So those are three things to put into action. They're hard to do, but a lot of it, again, starts with awareness, being very, very aware of our emotions and our thoughts when we're stressed.
Thank you. As you were speaking now, I had a thought that when you hear about burnout, what I was reading about it before and so on, would be that it's about when your results are not equal to the effort you put in. And so you feel a sense of burnout.
Mm-hmm.
You spend so much on something, so much time, effort, money, and you didn't get the results. And today we are talking about how it is caused by stress. And then also there's another element of extreme physical exhaustion. Both of us had a situation in our life when we were paying for our education while studying. And that is very stressful. A lot of jobs are incredibly stressful. Banking, consulting, they take everything out of you. If you want to be a high performer and you want to deliver above expectations and do what is right for the client and do everything you can for the organization. So how those three elements work together when it comes to burnout?
Yes, that's a great question, and one that I would hope to clarify for listeners. And I clarify this in one of my Harvard Business Review articles, that oftentimes people describe their experience as being burned out. That's the language that we're all familiar with these days. I hear the word burnout all the time. So they're experiencing a lot of stress, a lot of psychological tension, and they call it burnout. But in this Harvard Business Review article, I describe and I lay out the fact that we can feel really stressed at work, but not necessarily are we burned out. It could be other things. And those other things, it's actually a spectrum. When researchers measure burnout, think of a spectrum where one end of it is burnout, which is extreme emotional exhaustion, extreme cynicism, and reduced confidence in our ability to be effective at work. But it's quite extreme. I mean, think about burnout as the difference between having a headache or a migraine. So migraine level stress is similar in many ways to burnout. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is I feel really engaged at work. I feel effective at what I do. I have the energy that I need, psychological and physically. So those two ends of the spectrum, we get that engaged and burnout. But there are three other psychological conditions that we can experience at work. And again, oftentimes these things are called burnout, but it's not. One of those categories are profiles. Let's call them, they're more accurately called profiles. One profile is called ineffective. Ineffective people, or people who feel ineffective, typically feel ineffective because they feel like the work that they're doing isn't really making a difference. And that could be caused by they don't have the skills to do their job. They're thrown a bunch of new responsibilities that they don't know how to do or what to do with them, or they don't have the support or the resources or the training to be as effective as they could be. And so that creates a lot of stress, but it's not necessarily this extreme level of burnout. So ineffective, if you think about people who profile as ineffective, the intervention for them is very different than someone who's burned out. If I have an employee who tells me that they're feeling ineffective or they have symptoms of ineffectiveness, I'm going to look at, okay, what can I do to support them? Do they need more training? Do they need help with their workload? Anything that can make them more effective. The intervention is just very different than would be if you're burned out. The second profile is disengaged. Disengaged people are quiet quitters. A couple of years ago into the pandemic, we heard a lot about people quiet quitting. This profile are the ones that HR people do not want to hear. They don't want disengaged or quiet quitters in their workforce because their productivity tends to be low, right? They're just not delivering the way that they would be expected to. They are essentially, if you think about it, they're psychologically checked out from work. They're there physically, but in their minds, mentally, they're like, I'm somewhere else. I'm not putting any effort. I could put effort. I feel trained. I have the skills. I have the resources, but I just don't feel motivated. So it's mostly a motivation issue. So again, think about it. The intervention for people who are disengaged, very different than a group of people who are burned out or ineffective. Okay, so it's just disengaged people. They're also feeling stress, but it's a different kind of stress. All right, so then the fourth category, and this is the category that oftentimes people say that they're burned out, but really what they are is overextended. They're overworked. They have more work than they have time and resources to do the work. And this often is what we see with consultants and bankers, lawyers, and people, and accountants right now in the US. We know many of the accountants are in high tax season. And so for whatever period of the year, accountants experience higher degrees of feeling overextended because the work volume is significantly more than they physically or psychologically can handle. They are at high risk, though, of burning out if that continues for a prolonged period of time without adequate rest and recovery and support. So again, my point here on all of this stuff is that all of these things cause stress. All of these profiles, we experience stress, but the intervention and what we do to remedy how we're feeling and to help us relieve the stress is going to be very different depending on what's causing it.
This is very, very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing this. What about the person who is experiencing significant stress at work, but only because of people who creating that stress at work?
Mm-hmm.
Some people call them
and toxic coworkers. So toxic coworkers and toxic cultures are one of the number one drivers or causes of burnout in the workplace. I think that's not a secret, and there's plenty of research on it, and many of us have had that experience personally. I myself have worked on consulting projects where whether it was a client person or it was someone on my team or it was a toxic coworker. And these aren't just people that are hard or difficult to get along with. It's not just that. I mean, they are literally sabotaging the performance of other people or sabotaging the performance of the team. So I'm not an expert in what to do with toxic coworkers, but as a burnout researcher, though, what I would say is you need to, number one, protect your emotional health. And what I see oftentimes with people who experience the stress of a toxic coworker is they get overly emotionally invested. So that toxic coworker triggers something in them that creates some kind of an intense emotional reaction. And then they often can lock into that emotional intensity. Sometimes what happens is that toxic coworker triggers something in them from childhood. So it may have that person might remind them of their parent or a sibling or someone who bullied them at school. And so if you think about how we interact with people at work, it doesn't just happen. It's our experience with other people at work isn't just because of that experience with that one person. It is the result of all past experiences that we've ever had in our entire life and all of the things and all of the people that have ever triggered us. And so awareness is key here. And there's a section in the awareness chapter where I talk about triggers and really understanding not just what triggers you, but why things and why certain people trigger you. And the better we can understand our triggers and better manage them, the more likely we are to keep our distance from toxic coworkers and not let them into our psychological space.
And I think also in that situation, you should consider trying to find a way to exit as soon as possible, because you can only
absolutely
degree, and it takes so much effort and so much time, just not worth it.
Absolutely. It is. If you think about toxic coworkers or toxic culture, it's like keeping yourself in a room full of secondhand smoke. Why would we ever want to do that? And so if we know that it's bad for us, absolutely, I encourage people to think about an exit plan. If it's not changing, and if your efforts to change the culture or work with your boss to do something about that one toxic coworker, if that's not going anywhere, it comes back to values. And if you truly value your psychological health and your well-being, then you should be thinking about an exit plan.
And so now $1 million question is, okay, someone who is currently feeling the way you described the burnout, I'm there. I am as burnout as it can be. Let's say some of our listeners feel that way. What do they do? What are some of the recommendations to effectively get out of that situation?
Yes, effectively get out of burnout. So I'm going to start with a story. I'll tell you, about a year ago, I conducted a keynote speech. Actually, it was a workshop. It was a keynote, but kind of more of a workshop, couple of hours in the afternoon. Earlier that day, I was with the same group of people, and I saw this man get award. He received an award for top salesperson in his region. It was a big, big deal. Saw him walk across the stage. He looked very happy, and everybody clapped for him. It was great. And then when he was in my workshop, I noticed he was sitting towards the front, and I noticed he was really taking everything in. And during my workshop, I often ask my participants to take the burnout risk assessment, which tells you whether you are at low, moderate, or high risk of burnout. And so he took it along with everyone else. And at the end of the workshop, everyone else left the room, and he came up to me, and he had tears in his eyes. And I had goosebumps thinking about him. And he said, "Would you mind? Can we talk for just a moment?" And I said, "Absolutely. Let's go sit down." So we sat down and chatted. And he said, "I was just totally shocked when I took the burnout risk assessment. It came back as high risk." And I asked him, I said, does that feel true to you? And he said, "It absolutely does." He said, "But what's scary is that if you would have asked me yesterday or this morning when I got that award, I wouldn't have said I felt burned out, because I've just been going what feels like on autopilot. But when I stop and think, and when I really reflect on the questions that are in that risk assessment, it really had me thinking, like, wow, I'm suffering, and my family, my family's not doing well either." And he said that was really a bit of a wake up call. So I recommended a few things to him. And by the way, this was right about the time that I was writing the Recover, Reconnect, and Reimagine chapter. And I thought about him a lot as I was writing that chapter, and I did a lot of research on recovery. And while I was writing about recovery, there's a lot of stuff in there about how athletes recover from physical stress that they put on their bodies. And I think a lot of that, those principles apply to those of us who are in high stress, high performance work environments. Psychological stress is not a lot. It's different, of course, but we need mental recovery, psychological recovery, whatever that means for you. And I'm reminded too about another woman that I interviewed who was extremely burned out. And she told me, she worked in a healthcare system. She was an emergency medicine physician. And she told me that her burnout went on for quite a long time during COVID. She was working, crazy hours. And, we saw what people were experiencing in the emergency rooms during COVID. And she told me that she knew she was burned out. She knew she had to leave. And she realized at one point that she said, "I realized that I could not recover and heal in the same place that was making me sick." So for some people who have extreme burnout that's caused by really intense, emotional, extreme work conditions or environments, you have to ask yourself, can I heal while I'm here? Or do I need to take a week off? Do I need to take a sabbatical? Do I need to leave completely? And the answer to that is going to be different for every single person, depending on your conditions and your financial stability and all of that. But I think for people who are experiencing extreme burnout, you have to ask yourself those somewhat existential types of questions. What are you going to do with that information now that you know that you are putting yourself at extreme risk health wise.
And such a good sentence to end on, to bring it to the next question, because I was thinking about people like myself. So, for example, today I woke up at 5 a.m. I went to sleep after 12 yesterday. And the reason I'm doing it is not because I guess I have to. At this point in my life, I have a team. I can sleep more, but I have a big mission. And I just feel so bad not working those hours because of what I can do with that time.
Yeah.
And so for people who are like that, who are incredibly driven, who are doing it to themselves in a way because they want to accomplish certain things for the world, what would you say to them to help them? Maybe you can help them reframe it in their mind to create that sense of urgency that you know what you have to change.
Yeah. And you have to ask yourself, do I really need to change? First, what I would say, Chris, is thank you for doing the work that you're doing. And we need people like you to have a voice and to bring voice to these kinds of topics so we can truly help people who are suffering or who are at risk of experiencing burnout. What I think you're experiencing is a strong connection to meaningful work, which is one of the things I talk about in the Meaningful Connections chapter. When I study people with burnout immunity who have a high or really strong sense of meaningful work, they believe that their work matters. They know they can make a difference. They know they have a voice and it's powerful. That can be a major protector of burnout up until a certain point. And sometimes meaningful work can backfire. And I would ask everybody who has a high degree of meaningful work connection to just ask yourself, okay, but at some point I have a limit too. At some point I do also need to pay attention to what am I doing? Like, what are my work hours? And I'm only getting 5 hours of sleep. What am I doing? And what is that doing to me? So we might be able to get by with 4 or 5 hours of sleep for a few nights, but what am I doing over a long period of time? And then what is that doing to my physical health or my psychological health? So that helps us better understand where we need to create boundaries.
That is very true. And interestingly, similar to you, I also had really bad health scares, including related to very stressful work environment and burnout. And you still continue doing those things to yourself because you believe that what you're doing needs to be done. And so it is an important topic. And as leaders, we have to sometimes tell to ourselves what we would tell to our child. We would not want our child to work like this.
Right. Yeah. And some of our work patterns are become habitual, right? We've created these patterns of working that we think work for us, but then our life events change. We have children, or we get married, or we move across the country, or we have a new like just conditions in our life change that then I think could really force us, if we were patient with ourselves enough, force us to take a step back and say, have the patterns and the habits that I've created around work. They used to work for me, but will they continue to work for me now that my life conditions have changed and maybe my values have changed?
Kandi, when you decided for yourself that, you know what, I'm going to change things for myself, do you remember some of the things you have done in how you run your life that made a big difference?
Yes. I think the biggest thing I did that helped at the beginning, this was extremely powerful for me, and I actually integrate this now in my workshops when I teach this, is I became very clear on what my values are. I used to think I knew what my values are. And if you asked me to put down my top 5 values, I would list health and my family and all the many things that many people would do. But I was sitting in a classroom and we had this exercise that we had to do for like an hour. It wasn't just like a list your values. It was an hour-long exercise where we were given a number of prompts and asked to think about our values in many different ways, lots of questions. And by the end of it, it wasn't just like right away, but over the next couple of days, I was like, holy moly, that just created so much clarity for me. Like I'm so clear now that I used to say my health was important, but now I know why. Now I'm really clear what that means. Like, what does that look like when I say that I value my health? What are the behaviors that I have? What are my patterns, my habits, and all of that? So values exercises can be incredibly powerful. They were for me, and they work oftentimes when I do these in workshops. That's a good first step to create awareness around where there might be a disconnect between what you truly deeply value and what you're actually getting out of your work environment.
It reminded me of that part in your book where you were told about the high blood pressure. And then your thoughts were, oh, finally I will have no, I cannot take time off. Then the second thought, finally I will have an excuse to actually sleep. And then, oh, actually, hold on, there's something wrong here. I need help.
Yes. Yeah. The nurse kept checking my blood pressure, I think 4 times before she told me that my blood pressure was 200 over 110. And I went in just for a normal annual physical where they, you go in for 20 minutes, you get your A and then you're out. And then when she told me my blood pressure was so high and they gave me a bunch of medicine and all this stuff, and I was like really relaxed from all the Xanax and everything. And then my husband came. She told my husband he had to come pick me up. And then when my husband was there, she was telling my husband what I was supposed to do. And she said, Kandi's not allowed to go to work for at least 3 days, probably more like 5. Like, try to keep her on the couch for 5 days if you can. And yeah, my first thought was, I can't lay on the couch for 5 days. I have a big leadership development program to run next week. And then my second thought was, wow, okay, finally, someone's giving me an excuse to sleep. I'll take it. I'd love to sleep for a couple of days. And then my third thought, which really is even scary when I think about it today, was she's absolutely right. I'm not fine. That is not normal to have a blood pressure reading that high at the age of, 41 or 42 years old at the time.
I think it's also just something to be proud of the way you reacted to it, because many overachievers, until they actually drop and they are in some life-threatening situation, high blood pressure, I can handle it. Don't worry, I'll add 15 minutes to my sleep time. Something ridiculous like that. That is what usually happens with high achievers like you and me.
Exactly. Yes. And I was one of those. I was an insecure overachiever. And I thought stress is like a badge of honor. I remember my coworkers and I would even talk about like how much sleep we got the night before and how many all-nighters we pulled. And, we would complain about it, but there was also this undercurrent of a little bit of, I worked harder than you did sort of thing. Or yeah, and it was such a culture. I know many people work in these types of cultures right now where it's competitive with other people. It's competitive against ourselves. And those are, again, thinking traps that we get caught into. We tell ourselves, oh, like you said, that's a good way to put it. I'll just catch up on more sleep tonight and then my blood pressure will be fine. Well, that's actually not the way it works. No, our blood pressure is the result of many things other than just how much sleep you get at night.
Very true. Next question I have for you is one of my favorite questions to ask. And it's not specifically about burnout, but over the last few years, what were 2, 3 aha moments, realizations that really changed the way you look at life or the way you look at business?
Yeah, let me think. Gosh, there have been so many things that have changed my perspective. Truly, the last 10 years have been transformational for me in a lot of ways. I think one of the things that has been personally impactful for me is the work that I read from Kelly McGonigal. She has a TED Talk. Kelly McGonigal is a researcher, senior lecturer, I believe, at Stanford. And a lot of her research focuses on people who have what's called a stress is enhancing mindset. So I mentioned before that people who believe that, yes, I'm experiencing a lot of stress, but I think there's something good here. It's going to suck while I'm going through it. It's going to be so hard, but I know that on the other end of it, I can learn and grow from this. And I think back to the periods in my life when I have been at my best under stress. I've had a lot of stress, but I feel like in reflection, I think back to myself, oh, I actually did a good job. I was at my best under stress. It oftentimes was because I had a stress is enhancing mindset. And so when I read her work, which was a little bit before I started writing the book, I started practicing that more and more because I knew that it worked for me. And that was really just like a big aha sort of thing. Like, oh gosh, okay, it has worked for me. Now I'm going to double down. Everything I do. And if you think about it, writing a book and now being on podcasts and doing all these things that I've never done before is stressful. And I'm also approaching it with an attitude and a spirit of it's a conversation and we're going to have fun and it's not threatening and it's going to help other people and I'm going to learn and I'm going to grow from it. And so when I have that kind of a mindset going into a podcast or an interview, something that I would normally be pretty freaked out about or stressed or nervous, it's a lot easier because I have the right mindset going into it.
Very, very powerful. Thank you so much, Kandi. Is there something about burnout or recovery from burnout that you wish I asked you and I didn't? Now will be a great time to talk about it.
Yeah. I think some of the folks that are really interested in burnout assume that it's because that it has something to do with us as individuals. And so, maybe the question is burnout caused because we're doing something wrong or the organization is? And my answer to that, and I write about this in the book, I say, it's not you, it's your job. If you're feeling burned out and really overwhelmed and whatever your psychological experience is, it's not you. It is your job that's causing it. However, it is you, it is me when I'm experiencing it that can get myself out of it. That even though the conditions in my team or my organization are the things that are likely causing the stress and the burnout, but it's really me that has control over what to do with it. So that would be the question. I think I get that question every once in a while, and I want to help people understand more is like, what really causes burnout? Is it because something that we're doing wrong, or is it something that the organizations are doing?
This is one of the key things from our discussion today that I think people really needed to hear. So where can people learn more about your work, find your book, anything you want to share?
Yes, I would first ask people to go to my website. It's Kandi Wiens, Kandi, Wiens, WIENS.com. My website includes all the information about the book, and you can access all of my Harvard Business Review articles there. I write a monthly newsletter called A Monthly Dose of Burnout Prevention. That's completely free. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, you'll get those in your inbox. Right now, I'm actually doing 2 a month. So you'll see a lot of really great tips and strategies and tools in those newsletters and in the HBR articles that's not even in the book. They're bonuses to the book. So if you like what you see in those articles, you'll really like what you'll see in the book as well. So go to kandiwiens.com. Of course, I'd love it when people reach out on LinkedIn. That way I can follow other people's work too, because I follow people who follow me. So those would be the 2 best places, LinkedIn and my website.
Thank you, Kandi. I really appreciate you being here. I really appreciate all the work you are doing, everything that you shared today. For everyone listening, our guest today again has been Kandi Wiens. It is WIENS, and the first name is KANDI. Check out her book. It is called Burnout Immunity. And our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It is a free download. Go to firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And if you're preparing for interviews and need to improve your resume, you can get McKinsey and BCG Winning Resume. It is a free download. Go to firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. Kandi, again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I loved our conversation.
Same here. Bye, everyone. Looking forward to speaking to you all at the next session.